Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast.
At its core, this is an essay about what it means to remain intact while being continually redefined by others' intentions. It is not concerned with victory, loss, or spectacle. It studies the ethics of what is withheld, the ritual of survival, and the unspoken moral contracts that shape combat between bodies who agree to hurt and be hurt, but not to destroy. What boxing reveals isn't strength. It's how much intention a body can absorb without losing the shape of itself. Not how hard someone can hit, but how cleanly they can carry the pressure of being seen. Because every punch that lands says, "I see where you're unguarded." This is about the moments between action, the silence before the bell, the breath that comes just before rising, the way a glove rests against a cheek without landing. Violence, yes, but without malice. Pain, yes, but taught to wait its turn. Somewhere in the repetition, something else begins to emerge. Not a story, a drift, memory that doesn't narrate, only accumulates. The canvas starts to speak in pressure. The trainer's silence becomes an instruction. The rhythm becomes the only language that doesn't lie. And somewhere inside it, a person, bent, intact, waiting to see if coherence can still hold after being struck precisely. This is a discipline of restraint carried out inside a grammar of violence. A way of saying, "I'm still here," without ever needing the words. It didn't begin with a punch, not the one you remember, not the one that split vision into before and after. It began earlier, long before the sound, before the strike, before anyone in the room noticed anything had changed. It began in the breath, that slight adjustment, a reflex misinterpreted as calm, a delay that wasn't quite hesitation. The moment the body, without your permission, learned to welcome something it should have avoided. They call it instinct, but it's closer to ritual. A series of movements rehearsed not to express aggression, but to contain it. A way of meeting force without retreat. Not to win, just to remain. In the gym, they teach you how to slip, how to parry, how to counter. But what they're really teaching is how to receive, to let another person's decision arrive at your skin and to answer, not with anger, not even with fear, but with rhythm. As if your body knew what it meant to be addressed by intention. There's something cruel in how intimate it becomes. Not in the hit itself, but in the recognition that someone found your weakness not by accident, but through study, through attention, the kind of attention that borders on care. They don't hate you. That's what makes it harder. They see you clearly. They aim accordingly. And still, you stay. People ask why you do it, why you let yourself be broken down, reshaped. The truth isn't romantic. There is no glory in being hurt just right. But there is something else, a discipline that feels older than language, a code the body remembers before the mind can name it. You don't enter the ring to prove anything. You enter to be known in a way that doesn't require translation. Pain doesn't lie. Not in this context. It doesn't perform. It doesn't negotiate. It just arrives. And when it does, it asks you a question you didn't know you were capable of answering. Who are you when there is no time to narrate your value? When the only proof of your will is whether you get up. Most of boxing isn't in the highlight. It's in the recovery, in the seconds between rounds, in the stare across the canvas that isn't quite threat, isn't quite plea, just a shared understanding. We are both trying not to disappear. Every movement is a test, not of strength, but of coherence. Can you still feel like yourself while being reshaped? The body learns, not just how to block, but how to carry the meaning behind each blow. It's not about damage, it's about intention, about letting it land, then staying. There's a moment right after contact where nothing happens. Not yet, not fully. The body feels the strike, yes, but holds it in suspension, as if waiting for permission, as if unsure whether to believe what just arrived. That pause, brief as it is, becomes a kind of discipline. You've been trained not to respond too early, not to fold too soon. Pain in this setting is not a signal, it's a student. It learns when it's allowed to speak. They don't tell you this at first. The early lessons are clean. Angles, distance, timing, but underneath every drill is a deeper curriculum. How to become porous without surrender. How to take what was meant to stagger and file it for later. Delay becomes survival. Reaction a kind of betrayal, not of the body, but of the promise made when you stepped into the ring, that you would hold your shape even when asked not to. And so pain becomes part of the choreography. You feel it, of course, you just don't give it the floor, not until the round ends, not until the ropes cradle your breath and the water bottle tastes like forgetting. In those gaps, it returns. Sometimes gentle, like an afterthought, sometimes sharp, as if angry you ignored it, but it always comes. What matters is when. The audience sees the fight. They hear the thuds, see the sweat, count the knockdowns. What they miss is the restraint, the unsaid, the fraction of a second when you could have fallen but didn't. Not because it didn't hurt, but because hurting had to wait. You made it wait. That's what no one applauds. There's a cost, of course. Delayed pain is still pain. Stored in the ribs, the jaw, the back of the knee, carried into sleep, into silence, into rooms where no one throws punches, but where your shoulders still flinch. The ring teaches you how to compartmentalize, but it doesn't teach you how to unlock what you've hidden. Some learn to never let it out. They become legends for it. Durable, stoic, untouched, even as they fall apart. Others quietly leave, not broken, but exhausted by their own withholding. And a few, the rare ones, find a way to let pain speak without letting it rule. They learn when to let it rise and when to make it wait its turn. The sound is always the same. Sharp. Measured. Designed to cut through everything. And yet, each time the bell rings, something different is summoned. Not just the beginning of a round or the end of one, but a shift in how silence behaves. Before the fight, silence is expectation. After the bell, it becomes aftermath, a terrain you carry back to the corner, breathing through the edges of what just failed to happen. No one trains for the seconds between rounds. The stillness isn't taught, but it's there that you begin to understand what the fight is actually costing. Not in the punches you've taken or the ones you landed, but in the internal rearrangement that began the moment you stepped away from language and toward rhythm. Because that's what fighting is underneath the spectacle, a rhythmic act of relinquishing comfort. The bell doesn't just signal time, it creates a border between selves. Your corner speaks, but it's not advice you're absorbing, it's their tone, their urgency, or their calm. You listen not for meaning, but for stability, for confirmation that you are still, in some form, intact, that you can go back out there and remain recognizable to yourself. Because each round doesn't just ask your body to respond, it asks your identity to hold, to keep speaking in motion what it can no longer say in thought. Some fighters wait for the bell like it's rescue, others fear it more than the punches, not because they're tired, but because they've just found their rhythm, their justification, their clarity inside chaos. And the bell interrupts it, makes them return to a version of themselves they'd momentarily outgrown. Between rounds, the mask of control must be reassembled. The illusion of coherence must be rehearsed. That's what the bell demands, a performance of continuity. And yet, every bell is a different bell, not in tone, in effect. Sometimes it calls you forward, sometimes it calls you back. Occasionally, it sounds like a lie, promising an end that won't arrive. More rarely, it sounds like the beginning of something unspeakable. Like the moment you realize the fight is no longer about winning, that it's become about memory, about finishing what something inside you doesn't want resolved. No one hears that version of the bell but you. The crowd hears steel on steel. Your opponent hears timing, but you hear the distance between what you meant to become and what's standing now, gloves raised, waiting for the next silence to shape you. Violence in the ring isn't about anger. It's not even personal. If it were, it wouldn't work. The body can't calibrate intention with that much noise. What you need instead is rhythm. A tempo detached from emotion, a discipline that lets you deliver force without malice and endure it without collapse. There's a reason the best fighters look serene. It's not indifference, it's containment. They've learned to keep everything that doesn't belong in the ring just outside it. Rage, doubt, memory, because the second any of that leaks in, the rhythm breaks. And once rhythm breaks, the body loses trust in its own decisions. That's when you start reacting instead of composing. That's when you get hurt. Sometimes mid-round you can feel it shift. The violence gets noisy, intentions start to bleed through, someone starts swinging not to score but to prove something, and just like that, the architecture of the fight destabilizes. Now you're not exchanging information, you're trying to survive someone else's panic. That's when the discipline matters most, when the temptation to match chaos with chaos must be refused. It's hard to explain this to someone who's never stepped in. They think fighting is about aggression, but aggression is inefficient. It clouds, it wastes. The real craft is restraint, to throw without vengeance, to land without apology, to accept that what you're doing isn't violent because you hate, but because you've agreed to a shared grammar where pain is permitted, not weaponized. And still, there are moments when mercy could arrive but doesn't. Not out of cruelty, just momentum. There's no time to soften, no space to check if they're all right. You trust the ref, you trust the rules, but there's always a line you almost cross, a split second where you land something you didn't mean to, and they fold in a way you've never seen before. The rhythm keeps you moving, but part of you doesn't come back from that, because in that moment, you remember, this isn't a metaphor. This is a body, and it has limits. And you just touched one. Not to harm, but to reach something that doesn't speak, something that only answers when it's been hit just right. There are places in the body that don't feel like flesh, they feel like memory, like trust that hasn't yet been tested. It landed just above the guard, behind the breath, below the thought, a space between reflex and recognition. And in that moment, he changed. Not in how he moved, but in how he was being seen, because it wasn't just a strike. It was comprehension. The opponent hadn't guessed, he had studied, had watched long enough to know what would open and when. And that's what shook him, not the contact, the fact that someone had understood him without permission. The crowd saw the shot and cheered, but what they missed was the shift, the quiet way his rhythm faltered, not from pain, from exposure. His guard stayed up, his legs held, but something inside him had been named, and there was no putting it back. He kept fighting, the body knew what to do, but the sense of autonomy had blurred. He wasn't leading the fight anymore, he was responding to a reading he couldn't unfeel. It wasn't domination, it was precision, and precision, when uninvited, becomes intimacy. He would replay that moment later alone, not to analyze, to recover. He would try to remember exactly where the punch had landed, but what he'd really be trying to locate was the part of himself he'd lost in that recognition. Not a weakness, a secret. He'd walked into the ring believing there were still parts of him no one could reach, that his training had protected more than just muscle and bone. And in a second, that illusion dissolved. Not cruelly, just cleanly. After the fight, no one asked about it, no one knew, but he did. And that was enough. Because some punches don't bruise, they mark. And some fighters don't beat you, they find you. And once found, you can't unknow what it feels like to be fully seen. It wasn't hesitation, it was craft. Control so absolute it became invisible. To the crowd, it looked efficient. To anyone watching closely, it was restraint. And it was deliberate. This wasn't mercy. Mercy is emotional. This was something colder. A decision rehearsed in sparring sessions, drilled into timing, burned into muscle. To hit just enough to move someone, but not enough to end them. To say, I could have, without saying it out loud. That was the art. That was the authority. The ones he fought often didn't notice. They felt the impact, adjusted, fought back. They didn't realize what he was keeping from them. But sometimes, rarely, they did. And in those moments, something passed between fighters that had nothing to do with winning. recognition, not of weakness, of calibration. That he was measuring what the fight should cost, not just what it could take. What he didn't speak about was what that restraint cost him. How every withheld blow stayed in the body, not as tension, as silence. He left the ring quieter than he entered, not humble, muted like someone who had a sentence half spoken and chose not to finish it. He had knocked people out before. Everyone had. But he remembered the ones where he didn't, where he let the other fighter finish the round, knowing he could have ended it differently. He never regretted those moments, but they stayed with him, not as doubt, as trace. The hardest part wasn't the restraint. It was what followed. The looks from coaches who wanted a cleaner finish, the headlines that called him cautious, the questions from people who'd never been close enough to feel what a person's ribs do when they're about to break, but haven't yet. He never explained, not once, because explanation would have diluted the ethic behind the silence, and maybe that was the real discipline. Not in pulling the punch, but in knowing he'd never be applauded for it, that the most precise thing he ever did would live off camera, unnamed, unfelt by the world, just a moment where his body said enough, and meant it. He threw it not to harm, not even to set something up, but to listen, to hear where the other fighter lived, what they guarded without knowing it. Each jab had its own tone. Some checked distance, others checked belief. He watched for how the body responded, not just the movement, but the meaning behind it. A lean too far, a blink, a hand that twitched late. The jab wasn't an attack, it was a tension, sharp, repetitive, patient. Opponents hated it, not because it hurt, but because it revealed. It made them react before they understood why. And that reaction, however small, began to shape the round. They weren't being overwhelmed, they were being read, piece by piece. Without anger, without force, just rhythm. He didn't rush it. Never doubled up for show, never added flourish. The jab lived in its simplicity, in the refusal to hurry knowledge. He let the other fighter feel every one. Not dramatically, just enough to remind them, I'm here, I'm watching. The ring didn't forget, it held the shape of each round that had nearly undone him. It remembered where he hesitated, where he bled, where he landed a punch that changed nothing. The crowd saw the fight unfolding now, but he felt the fights that had already passed, not like visions, like pressure, as if the air carried the imprint of who he used to be. Each movement risked stepping into a version of himself he hadn't fully left behind. He adjusted not just for the opponent, but for the ghost of his own uncertainty. Some spots felt safe. Others asked questions he didn't want to answer. He couldn't explain why his feet drifted away from a specific section of canvas, or why he sometimes paused at the ropes, not from fatigue, but from recognition. The body remembers differently than the mind. It doesn't narrate, it navigates. The worst memories weren't always tied to pain. Sometimes they were tied to silence. The moment he landed the perfect shot and didn't follow, the time he waited too long for a signal that never came. He didn't panic. That was its own kind of surprise. Something in him had already prepared for this. Not the knockdown, but the decision that would come after. He rolled, checked his feet, his hands, his breath, and slowly, without rush, returned to standing. Not to prove anything, but to see if standing still meant something. The crowd reacts to the rise. They cheer resilience, courage, willpower. But what they don't see is what the fighter has to carry back with him. Because when you stand after being dropped, something follows, an echo, a weight that wasn't there before. Not shame, not fear, just the knowledge that the shape of who you are can be interrupted and must now be held together by choice. It wasn't the fall that mattered, it was the time he took before getting up. That's where the real fight was. In the breath he took while the count rose and the world waited, and the quiet answer he gave without speaking, that he was still there. Fighters don't need strategy whispered to them between rounds. They need anchoring. And this silence, it didn't anchor. It tested, not like anger, more like a mirror reflecting what hadn't yet been said out loud. you've begun to disappear from yourself. He knew what it meant. The trainer wasn't giving up. He was giving space, the kind that doesn't instruct, the kind that trusts or doubts without explanation. It hurt more than any punch, because silence like that comes only when words would make things worse. When saying the wrong thing might push you over the edge you're pretending isn't there. He'd always feared this round. Not the one where the opponent was stronger, the one where the corner stopped guiding, where he had to decide whether he was still the fighter they trained or just the one left standing. Sometimes the most generous thing you can give someone is a moment without rescue.